If you want to hear more about it, search the archive. Egypt, is that another...
It's a very complicated matter. Egypt, of course, pays a very close attention to what happens internally. And in the past, successive Ethiopian governments have accused Egypt of backing rebel movements to weaken the Ethiopian state. And I think Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government is also doing the same. Some of the opposition key figures that are behind bars are being accused of, for example, Jawar Mohammed is being accused of sending around 200 trainees to Egypt to be trained militarily. And so Egypt has always been used as a bogeyman for successive Ethiopian regimes by way of weakening the Ethiopian state. There's a history to that because Egypt is paying very close attention, and of course Egypt being very wary of the dam. I don't think they will sit back and watch Ethiopia complete this dam while there is this opportunity of internal violence that they can seize so that they can benefit from a weak central government that is not going to be destined to finish the GERD. Which way Egypt is going to go is something that we're going to have to wait and see. There are people who are suggesting that Egypt might be backing the TPLF if it goes into a rebel movement, but this is something that we will have to pay very close attention. But Egypt has a stake in Ethiopia's internal politics, and it will seize every opportunity available in its disposal to make sure that the dam is not completed.
Let's hear from the government. Mustafa Umar is the president of Ethiopia's Somali region and an executive member of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party. Like other supporters of the government, he describes the military action as a law enforcement operation against the TPLF. When I spoke to him, I began by asking him about the reports of many civilian deaths.
Yeah, we are not happy with any civilian death or displacement. The government is taking maximum precautions to avoid that. But the law enforcement operation was brought by the actions of the TPLF. And as a sovereign country, Ethiopia has the right to enforce the rule of law in any part of the country.
It's interesting, though, you talk about a rule of law operation, enforcing the rule of law, but these are Ethiopians. It seems extraordinary that you would go to war with your fellow countrymen.
Yeah, what would you do with a fellow countrymen who are hell-bent on destroying the country, dismantling the country, having sinister objectives of not allowing anybody else to live in peace once they lost power? What would you have done?
I think the options that people might point to are negotiation, mediation from outside, and perhaps addressing this question of why Tigrayans feel marginalised.
Well, it has been tried. Perhaps the international community and international media are not aware of the tireless efforts that have been made in the last 2.5 years to try to bring TPLF to their sense, to dissuade them from the very destructive, violent activities they were conducting in different parts of the country. Now, speaking of the marginalization of the Tigrayans, perhaps you are aware that the TPLF was in power for the last 27 years in the country. So what marginalization are we talking about? Despite having only 6% of the population, they were ruling this country for 27 years. So once they lost power and others came to power, is it right for them to say that this country cannot continue unless we are ruling it? Now, what the TPLF is saying is that they are speaking for others like me who come from the Somali region, Somali part of the country, and they want to tell everybody that regions have lost power just because the TPLF lost power at the center. So the fact is the TPLF is neither a federalist force nor a democratic party.
If this is a legitimate law and order enforcement measure, then why is it necessary to shut down the internet, the phone service, the electricity? It's very hard to get a real picture of what's going on in Tigray right now.
In most cases, the TPLF itself cut most of the electricity in order to stop the advance of the military.
So this is not something that's been orchestrated by the central government, which clearly has control of the internet.
Yeah, the internet is a different matter. For a limited period of time, the government can decide to ensure that the safety of its military and its law enforcement agencies is not jeopardized. They can decide. There can be such a decision. But however, most of the blackout, for instance, the electricity, is done by the TPLF.
What does victory look like then?
Well, we are making a lot of progress, and I think close to 50-60% of what is the Tigray region is now liberated from the junta, and the remaining part of the operation is expected to go very well in the coming days.
The perception is, though, that Ethiopia has gone to war with its own people. It has cut a deal with the leader of Eritrea in order to wage war on a part of its own country. Do you accept that description?
That's not the perception of Ethiopians, crucially. And what matters at this stage is the perception among Ethiopians. I know that a handful of international media personnel and others have been peddling that line in the last couple of weeks. However, the perception inside Ethiopia is that the junta that has been killing Ethiopians in all parts of the country and that have now decided to make their last stand in Tigray that must be brought to law. Perhaps you miss the anger of most of Ethiopians against the TPLF. The TPLF has committed unspeakable atrocities against Ethiopians when it was in power, and now that it was removed from power, it continues to sponsor violent groups in different parts of the country, and also it does not want to allow the Tigrayan people to have any other alternative political ideas.
But if that's the case, isn't that essentially what appears to be the message from the central government, that it's our way or no way?
No, the central government's position is that the constitution of the country must be respected. There are ways of handling political differences. Attacking the national military is not one of them. Going along and organizing elections without the approval of the federal government, the federal institutions mandated to do this is not one of them. Sponsoring violent groups in order to incite intercommunal and inter-ethnic and inter-religious conflict in different parts of the country is not a way of expressing your political views. So what should the government have done when all of this was being done by the TPLF? The TPLF left the government no room other than to enforce the rule of law.
So just finally then, for a positive vision then, what would you say is Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's vision for Ethiopia?
The Prime Minister's vision and the Prosperity Party's vision, of which I am part of, is to ensure a multinational federal system in Ethiopia. Despite what the TPLF is saying, the federal arrangement will continue. We are the proponents of multinational federal system. We know what the country has gone through in the last 27 years under a false federalism. We want true federalism, and we think we have a chance of achieving that with TPLF removed from power and democratic forces coming together to lead the country.
That's Mustafa Omar, President of Ethiopia's Somali region and also a member of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party. Awololo, what is really clear from that is that the TPLF has other ethnic or regional enemies. This isn't all just about the central government versus the TPLF.
I honestly don't think Mustafa Omar, who is handpicked by Abiy Ahmed and installed as a president for the region, can speak for the Somali people. He has particular views on certain things, but I don't believe what Mustafa said actually represents what most Somalis think. I mean, this conflict is ultimately about the future identity and character of the Ethiopian state. On the one hand, you have Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party that is determined to recreate or to return the country to the assimilationist past, a more centralized government where Abiy controls everything from the center. On the other hand, you have federalist forces who believe in the idea of the self-determination of ethnic groups, where specific ethnic groups have their own government at the regional level, have autonomy, and at the center have shared rule, consolidate a multicultural Ethiopian state together with everybody else. Now, what Mustafa is saying is that this is a law enforcement operation. I mean, you cannot have a law enforcement operation that is backed up by fighter jets, including soliciting external actors through the armed forces. The moment the confrontation between the central government and the regional government goes beyond the use of the police, then we are in a different territory. That is the territory of war. And whatever TPLF has done in the past, and I think all of us on this panel agree that TPLF introduced a multinational federal system, it did not honor the key principles of that system. But most actors, particularly in the marginalized South, including the Oromo, agree with the view that the only future the only plausible political arrangement for Ethiopia going forward is a multinational federal system. It's Abiy Ahmed who is determined to impose that vision by force. I think it's important to remember that the war that he is prosecuting in Tigray now is very much a continuation of the war that he has begun in places like Oromia. In Tigray, he could not impose his will in the same way that he did in Oromia because Tigray is armed, it's autonomous, it has been preparing for war just as the federal government was. So I think, listening to Mustafa describe things in the way he did just shows how really Orwellian the Ethiopian state has become in terms of just, having no regard to facts and truths whatsoever. He said the government can restrict access to internet, but when it comes to electricity, he said electricity was cut by the TPLF. Why would the government cut internet if it is committed to rules and principles that are constitutionally enshrined? This is an armed conflict. There are international rules that apply. Why would the government not want, for example, independent actors and media to go in and monitor and tell us the facts?
Sidale Lema, it is a dangerous moment, undoubtedly. Is it also the moment at which the hopes for a sort of a federalized Ethiopia, a democratic Ethiopia, are extinguished?
Well, if this drags on, I think we can simply say goodbye to any democratic transition that Ethiopia was poised to go through under Abiy Ahmed. I'm saying this because as we speak now, there are so many atrocities happening that we're not paying attention to because war creates impunity. War creates that environment where any injustices that are happening outside of the zone, the conflict zone, can be simply excused, as normal things to happen. What is happening in the southern part, in Matakal, in Benishangul, and in Konso, in the second woreda of the southern nations and nationalities, and in Oromia, in the western and southern parts of Oromia, where the government is already at armed conflict with the Oromo Liberation Army, is absolutely horrifying. As we speak now, that is happening, which means the country was held together by the force of the federal army, which was dispatched in every corner, so to say, in Oromia and in the south, and places where they were put under a command post of the federal army. Now, those forces are mobilized to the north to be a part of this conflict and have left those areas that they have been policing very vulnerable. So there's a lot of killing happening. We are receiving very alarming reports from these areas that I mentioned. Where does that lead us to? When is the government going to pay attention to and control these conflicts? And they're not small. There are armed movements in many places that the government is not admitting. And so if this goes on, if this war or if this conflict, however they call it, goes on, drags on indefinitely, I think this will see a fractured Ethiopia, which is far from a transitional movement that the Prime Minister promised to deliver.
Alex de Waal, where is this leading to, do you think?
My greatest worry is that in the past, civil wars in Ethiopia have been fought among political entities and the population has suffered. This one is worse because it is actually going into the population itself. Groups are being mobilized against one another on the basis of their identity. And that kind of division is something that is deeply, deeply disturbing and something that has to be stopped before it gets out of hand.
Well, that's a deeply pessimistic note on which to end this week's Real Story, but that is it. Thank you very much to all our guests, Alex de Waal, Sidale Lema, Awol Alo. Thank you all very much. If you'd like to listen to the programme again, or perhaps one from the archive, such as our discussion last week on what President-elect Biden might be able to do about climate change, or of course you could look up the programme about Ethiopia's Renaissance Dam project. You can do so via our website or your preferred podcast app. Just search for BBC The Real Story and do subscribe. But for this week, from me, Ritula Shah, and the whole team, that's The Real Story. Thank you very much for your company and do join us again next time.
This is the BBC World Service.
100 Women.
I am Beatriz de la Pava, and I'll be bringing you a soundtrack of the fight for equality.
You don't own me. R-E-S-P-C-T, find out what it means.
Songs that inspired generations of women everywhere.
Rebel Girls Soundtrack. Sunday at 3 and 14 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Science in Action with Roland Pease.
In addition to the good news that vaccines really do seem to work against COVID-19, further good news that the immune system stays armed and strong against the virus for months and months. We will have the details.
Business Matters is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, it's 5 p.m. on Friday in Sacramento, 2 p.m. Saturday in Wellington. Welcome to Business Matters. Today, Saudi Arabia prepares to host the G20 summit this weekend. President Trump's expected to make a virtual appearance, but are the hosts looking past him to his successor?
Saudi Arabia has a relationship with the United States that's strategic and historic and bipartisanship. Whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, Saudi Arabia is extremely important to the United States, and the United States is extremely important to Saudi Arabia.
Speaking of Mr. Trump, we'll be looking at his business and media prospects and possible legal difficulties once he's out of the White House in January. And after this year's Asia-Pacific Economic Summit winds up, we'll hear why New Zealand is already looking forward to hosting next year's shindig. Welcome to Business Matters. Let's start with the BBC News.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the result of the presidential election have suffered further setbacks. Georgia has certified its results, showing that Joe Biden beat Mr. Trump. Senior Republicans from Michigan said after meeting Mr. Trump that the certification process must be free from threats and intimidation, and they had seen no information to overturn Mr. Biden's victory in their state. But as Nomia Iqbal reports, none of this seems to be deterring Mr. Trump.
This is about Donald Trump trying to undermine the election results. He even today at his press conference came out and said, I won the election. I got more than 73 million votes. Of course, Joe Biden got many more votes. The tally's coming up to about 80 million. But it's not stopping Donald Trump. We've also heard that he's looking at the idea of inviting Pennsylvania's state legislators to the White House, presumably to try and put pressure on them too.
The American drugs manufacturer Pfizer and its partner BioNTech say they are filing for emergency authorization in the US of their COVID-19 vaccine. The US Food and Drug Administration has said it aims to approve the vaccine in the first half of December. Earlier, Donald Trump had repeated his accusation that drug companies deliberately waited until after the election before announcing their vaccine results.
So they waited and waited and waited, and they thought they'd come out with it a few days after the election. And it would have probably had an impact. Who knows? Maybe it wouldn't have. I'm sure they would have found the ballot someplace, the Democrats and the group. These corrupt games will not deter us from doing what is right for the American people. And I will always put American patients first.
The eldest son of President Trump has tested positive for coronavirus. In a statement, a spokesman said Donald Trump Jr., who is 42, had been diagnosed at the start of the week and had been quarantining at his cabin since receiving his test result. The statement added that Donald Trump Jr. had been completely asymptomatic so far. The US Justice Department says an American Jewish man convicted of spying for Tel Aviv 35 years ago has been released from his strict parole conditions, allowing him to travel to Israel. Jonathan Pollard was arrested in Washington in 1985 and received a life sentence. As Barbara Platt-Usher reports, the development is likely to please Israel.
Jonathan Pollard is a former U.S. Navy intelligence analyst who passed classified documents to Israel during the late days of the Cold War, some of which are reported to have ended up in Soviet hands. He was released from prison in 2015, but was confined by strict parole terms to the United States, despite Israeli pressure to allow him to leave. The Trump administration has distinguished itself by fully backing many of Israel's positions in its conflict with the Arabs, and it has continued to focus on Israel in its final weeks. Allowing Mr. Pollard the freedom to move to Israel may be a parting gift.
Barbara Platt-Usher. World News from the BBC. Anti-racism protests are being staged across Brazil following the brutal killing of a black man by two white security guards in Porto Alegre. The death of João Alberto Silveira Freitas has echoes of the murder of George Floyd in the United States in May, as Leonardo Rocha reports.
The incident was caught on video and witnessed by many people, including the victim's wife, who were kept away by other security guards. It happened on Thursday night in the southern Brazilian city of Porto Alegre. The scenes are horrific. There's blood everywhere and the beating goes on for several minutes. Witnesses said the guards used the same controversial knee-on-the-neck hold that killed George Floyd in the United States earlier this year. The dead man has been named as 40-year-old João Alberto Silveira Freitas, a local community leader. The two security officers have been sacked.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for the opening of humanitarian corridors to help civilians caught in the fighting in Ethiopia's Tigray region. He warned of what he called the dramatic humanitarian impact. Mr. Guterres said the Ethiopian government has rejected all attempts at mediation and fighting is continuing with hundreds dead. The UN is preparing for an influx of up to 200,000 refugees into neighbouring Sudan. The French Parliament has voted through the most controversial article of a new security law that has prompted major protests in cities across the country. The measure prohibits the publication of images of police operations in which individual officers can be identified. Critics have argued that the restriction could breach human rights law. The German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier has marked the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials by encouraging the United States to return to the model for international justice that the trials created. President Steinmeier lamented that under President Trump, Washington had worked against the International Criminal Court in The Hague. BBC News.
Hello, welcome everyone. Fergus Nichol here with the BBC's Business Matters. In a moment, our main headline, in fact, two headlines, as we have an economic summit double bill for you, with APEC winding up and the G20 about to get underway. In the second half of the programme, the post-White House future for Donald Trump.
When he got elected, I said, well, you know, people could be in for a surprise here because everybody thinks they've elected president and he believes he just became king. So doing what he did before would now be just too mundane for him.
But will legal difficulties and huge outstanding debts create problems for the Trump brand in 2021? Let's welcome Colin Peacock of Radio New Zealand, who's with us from Wellington this Saturday afternoon. Colin, good to have you back. Nice to hear you.
Hi there, Fergus. Good to be with you.
Great to have you. We have a lot to talk about. We've got Jacinda Ardern, who's been talking about APEC. We'll get to that in a few minutes. We're going to talk a bit about housing. We could talk about tourism. Lots of Kiwi headlines for us as we go through the hour. Welcome, Colin. We can start, though, in Saudi Arabia. Well, at least Saudi Arabia as hosts of a virtual summit of the Group of 20 leading industrial nations. Unlike the APEC summit that we were talking about this time yesterday, President Trump is expected to take part in some way. The administration's confirmed that. We don't know what's going to happen. The BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in Riyadh ahead of the G20. So I asked her what we should expect.
Well, there's a lot of firsts for this G20 summit. The first time it's been hosted by an Arab state, the first time by Saudi Arabia, the first time, of course, it's happening in the midst of a global pandemic. And that means that some disappointment for Saudi Arabia when it was honored last year with the hosting of this summit. It was looking forward to using this as a showcase. A major oil producer trying to diversify its economy, huge economy in the region, trying to encourage investment, including tourism, so that it can show the world how Saudi Arabia is changing. And then it finds itself having to put the responses to this global pandemic at the top of the agenda. Now, they're trying to make something positive out of this, saying, well, we can emphasize our digital diplomacy, we can emphasize the importance, and I think this will be one of the main issues on the agenda, and that is a collective response to the global pandemic. Saudi Arabia has been emphasizing that this has to be focus on not just the rich nations. And of course, Fergus, you've heard all the stories. We've seen how rich nations are buying up all the PPE, buying up the diagnostic equipment, and now buying up the vaccine doses. The G20 is expected to come out with a firm commitment to ensure that there is fair and global access to these crucial vaccines. That is going to be one of the issues which will be at the top of the agenda this weekend summit.
This summit, Lise, of course, features the current US administration, and I'm wondering how much in the back of the minds of the Saudi delegation will be the next US administration. What do they think of Joe Biden?
Well, they're being very coy about it, obviously. Don't forget that the first foreign trip of President Trump was to Riyadh, and there's been a very, very close relationship. President Trump has defended the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, whether it comes to controversial arms deals, arms that are used, of course, in the war in Yemen, whether it is giving protection to the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who, of course, was at the heart of the controversy over the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. President-elect Biden talks very differently about the Saudi kingdom. He described them as a pariah during the election campaign. But the Saudis are making light of this, saying, well, there's a 75-year-old relationship. There's many issues, strategic interests and issues that will bring us together. And so when I sat down with the Saudi Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Adel Al-Jubeir, I said to him, are you worried about President-elect Biden?
Not worried at all. Saudi Arabia has a relationship with the United States that's strategic and historic and bipartisanship. Whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, we have huge interests at stake. We both are extremely close partners in the fight against extremism and terrorism. We both are working towards bringing peace between Israelis and Palestinians, stabilizing Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. We are dealing with international energy issues, and we're dealing with financial issues. Saudi Arabia is the heart of the Islamic world and extremely important to the United States, and the United States is extremely important to Saudi Arabia. This relationship will go nowhere.
So that's the Saudi Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. Lise, bring us back to where you started. One of the crucial background elements of this G20 summit is the pandemic. How has Saudi Arabia weathered the last few months in terms of health, in terms of the national economy?
Well, of course, Saudi Arabia, even though it's affected by the downturn in oil prices, the downturn in investment, it still is a very wealthy nation. And just speaking with officials here, they want to highlight how well they think they've done. We went to get tested, of course, for the coronavirus when we arrived after 2 days quarantine. There's a huge compound called mass testing. We got our results back within 12 hours. They're expanding their testing, and Saudi Arabia is open for business. Contrast that to the United Kingdom and many other countries where there's a lockdown again and there's talk of another lockdown. So yes, of course, Saudi Arabia was affected. Yes, the volume of business activity is not the same, but you don't feel here that everything has ground to a halt in the way it has in many other parts of the world.
That's Lise Doucette reporting from Riyadh. So part one of our double bill. And as I mentioned this time yesterday, we were hearing about the APEC summit, bringing together, in cyberspace anyway, leaders from across the Asia-Pacific economic region. We didn't hear from Donald Trump. We didn't hear from Scott Morrison, the Australian PM. So has it been a bit of a bust? Not according to the hosts. Muhyiddin Yassin is the Prime Minister of Malaysia.
Subject, of course, during the meeting, all the APEC leaders reaffirmed their concerns pertaining to the impact of COVID-19 on developing economies, with strong emphasis placed to protect people's well-being and at the same time keeping economic activities moving so that people's lives and, of course, livelihoods can be safeguarded. Now, despite the challenges due to the pandemic, this has not deterred leaders from securing consensus of the participating economies to move beyond 2020. I think this is important. Strong focus on realizing the fundamental social economic goals that was first charted out in Bogota 26 years ago. APEC's work this year has been focusing on the importance of economic recovery post-COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, equally important is to accelerate work towards developing the COVID-19 vaccine and making it a global public good, and that is available, affordable to all, and that is multilateralizing the vaccine.
multilateralizing the vaccine. Not sure what that means. Now, as I mentioned, we were on air last night doing the APEC story, and as luck would have it, the PM of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, happened to be addressing the virtual summit. We took some of her remarks live on the show. Let's bring in Colin then, Colin Peacock of Radio New Zealand. How did it go down? And she specifically said, we want you guys, we want collectively to articulate a vision. Was that the kind of vision she had in mind?
Yes, I think so. As we heard Lise Doucette say there about the G20, the Saudi hosts had planned to use it as something of a showcase for the country. Of course, COVID has then derailed those plans somewhat and overtaken the agenda. And in 2021, that'll be the case, though, for APEC, with New Zealand being the host. It's going to be a virtual event, but the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, will be able to talk about the success New Zealand has had in getting an economic bounce back going in the time of COVID. And in fact, that was the backdrop really to her remarks to the APEC delegates this past weekend about taking the reins and hosting next year.
New Zealand takes on the chair of APEC next year, and we will be asking three things of APEC economies: to join together to reignite growth and plan for a long-lasting economic recovery, to work together to show leadership and innovation, to work for the collective good, and to grow together, to foster prosperity and well-being that is sustainable, inclusive and digitally enabled. These are challenging times, but these times also offer a significant opportunity to do things differently, APEC included.
Yeah, so interesting that she should say that about an opportunity to do things differently, because you asked there about how this has gone down at home. Her government has just been re-elected and they've been given absolute power, and previously they've had to lead coalition governments. Now she leads a country which has taken a very firm stance on COVID-19. We have closed borders, so unlike Saudi Arabia, as we heard there from Lise, not quite open for business but trying to export like crazy. So her focus will be on internationally, getting countries to agree to multilateral lateral agreements, get world trade moving and continuing. But domestically, people are going to be looking at what she's saying there. She's talking about sustainable policies, sustainable energy, things like that. And these are things she hasn't made great progress on in 3 years in charge here in New Zealand. So domestically, she'll be looking for, people will be looking for her to kind of walk the talk that she's certainly happy to do on the international stage.
Really quickly, on the virtual thing, I was quite surprised that New Zealand's committing to be virtual in 2021. You'd have thought this was one place you could have a real summit next year. It was going to be in New Zealand.
Well, in fact, COVID-19's been a kind of weird blessing for the country, because last year the convention centre being built to host APEC 2021 was burnt down when a single roofing worker left a torch on the roof, and a half a block of central Auckland went up in smoke. So having it virtual is actually saved the government a bit of an embarrassment there.
One quick one, follow up on this. We were hearing earlier in the week about Australia's increasingly antagonistic relationship with China. I'm just wondering how Auckland is in terms of looking at China, looking at South Korea, Japan, other big bilateral relationships with Asia.
Oh, no, they certainly want to keep those going. In fact, New Zealand has skin in just about every game. There was the RCEP agreement that was signed last week. New Zealand's still committed to that CPTPP agreement. It was to be the TPP, but Mr. Trump, one of the first things he did in 2016 was pull out of that. That had to be reconfigured. So New Zealand's still foursquare behind that, wanting these multilateral agreements to be signed and to be progressed. And that certainly will be on New Zealand's agenda, the messages they're trying to push for APEC 2021, and indeed in the year to come up to that.
Great. Colin, thanks for that. This is Business Matters. Fergus Nicol hosting today. Let's take you back to our London studio. David's got our headlines, please.
Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the outcome of the US presidential election have suffered further setbacks. The drugs manufacturer Pfizer and its partner BioNTech are filing for emergency authorization for their coronavirus vaccine, meaning they could start distributing it by mid-December. An American Jewish man who was convicted of spying for Tel Aviv in the United States 35 years ago has had his parole restrictions lifted and can travel to Israel. And anti-racism protests have been staged in Brazil after a black man was beaten and killed by two white security guards.
David, thanks. He'll be back at past with a fuller summary of the world news. We've heard quite a lot in recent months about the failure of the US Congress to agree a new economic rescue package to help American business cope with the continuing impact of the COVID pandemic. Well, there's been a twist this week in something of a spat between the US Treasury and the US Federal Reserve. I've been talking to Chris Lowe, chief economist at FHN Financial in New York.
The Treasury Secretary sent an open letter to Jay Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, reminding him that the CARES Act, which was the big U.S. pandemic relief act, granted the Treasury to give money to the Fed to establish lending facilities through the end of this year. What he said was, you can hang on to any of the money you've already used for making loans, but we'd like to have the rest of it back. That's about $422 billion, because the Treasury wants to combine that with some 20-plus billion of its own cash allocated in the CARES Act and give it back to Congress, hopefully to break the stalemate on the pandemic aid, which we've been now debating since August in Congress in the U.S.
With or without this money, Chris, does anybody on Wall Street believe that a CARES Act 2.0 is possible in the, 8 weeks left of this administration?
I think some of them actually do. I think it's crazy. So here's Mnuchin's logic. The Treasury Secretary is thinking he negotiated with Nancy Pelosi up to the election. And at that point, she wanted a $2.2 trillion package. He had proposed a $1.8 trillion package. So you see, they're just $400 billion apart. That's about how much cash the Fed has on hand.
Nice.
Problem solved. Yeah, except there's a problem with that, because even before the election, it didn't look like Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, was actually going to accept even the $1.8 trillion deal. In other words, the White House might have been okay with it. The Senate probably wasn't. And they still think small is the way to go.
Our thanks to Chris Lowe, speaking to us from FHM Financial in New York. Well, to dig into what the US Federal Reserve System is up to, my colleague Kai Risdal of the Marketplace program on American Public Media has been talking to John Williams, chairman and CEO at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. First, about the ways the economy in America has been evolving these past several months.
I do think that the economy is always undergoing significant change. The use of technology, working from home, those were happening already. What we've seen is just an acceleration in terms of how our economy works. And I think those are fundamental changes that are going to affect the workforce, productivity, global competitiveness as well.
I wonder what you think of the idea that the easy part of this recovery is done, that we have had our fiscal stimulus, we've had tools that the Fed has used, and now we're kind of heading into the unknown. Do you buy that?
I've actually said I will never use a letter to describe this recession recovery ever. I think that we just have to think about this as being a very unique situation. We've seen the economy bounce back far faster than anyone could have expected. At the same time, we've seen, obviously, severe hardship. We're still down 10 million jobs in the U.S. economy relative to February. I mean, we're still in a severe recession. But it's so much driven by COVID and the fact that, there are certain segments, important segments of our economy that we don't interact with, restaurants and theaters and travel that we talked about. So I think that, to me, it is always kind of unusual. The whole thing has been since March, and we just need to adapt and use our tools the best we can.
I think you said in a speech a number of months ago, midsummer-ish, that it's going to be 3 years before we're close to normal. You sticking to that?
Well, since then, I think two things that made me a little bit more positive about that longer-term outlook. Obviously, right now, with the cases so high and all the challenges we've talked about already, the short-term issues are still very challenging. I would say that my view over the next 3 years, if anything, has become somewhat more upbeat. One is we've seen our economy rebound more strongly than I expected. And the other is the news on some of the medical breakthroughs, I think, is helpful in that regard. We'll have to see how the economy evolves in the next few years. But overall, I'm feeling somewhat more optimistic around that. But it's still going to take a few years to get to, I think, to get a full recovery.
what needs to be done to help small businesses survive. Hundreds of thousands of them have gone away so far.
The answer to all these questions is going to be that it depends on COVID-19. I think that the little bit of good news here is we are still seeing in the data signs of a lot of creation of new small businesses. We should be doing whatever we can, and I don't mean the Fed here when I say we, but think about how can we best help creating a new, vibrant, entrepreneurial small business community coming out of that.
What can the Fed do to help those small businesses that, as we both know, drive a lot of the employment in this country?
I think our number one thing that we are doing is, getting America back to work, within the confines of what's happening with COVID. But as soon as we can get people back to work, buying things, the better it is for those small businesses, whether they've got, one employee or hundreds of employees. That's really the solution for a lot of these issues.
That's John Williams, who is the chair at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, past, of course, of the US Federal Reserve System. Let's bring Colin back in from Wellington, New Zealand. Colin, we've talked over the recent months about the way the New Zealand economy has responded to the turbulence caused by COVID. We talked in the past about the government rescue plans and how much it's going to cost. Bring us up to date. Where are we now in terms of stability, small businesses surviving, and the price tag?
Yeah, small businesses are doing better. In fact, the whole economy is doing rather better than people expected in the position that we're in now after we had our lockdown in March and April. That was really the pinch crunch time for our economy. It seems to be coming back faster than anybody expected. In fact, the unemployment rate to the last numbers were just 5.3%, and that was lower than National Treasury forecast or just about any major bank that provides forecasts for their customers. So that's all pretty good. For small businesses, and New Zealand really is a country where there are a lot of small businesses run on fairly tight margins. They were very vulnerable, very worried. So the wage subsidy, so employers are able to apply if their turnover was hit by 30% or more, or forecast to do so, could get the wages subsidised for their employers. That worked pretty well. But that came to an end. What they did to replace that, as the economy looked like it was recovering faster than had been predicted, was introduce small business loans, and these will extend out to the end of 2023, most of them incorporating a 1 to 2 year interest-free period. So that will keep a lot of businesses going. And they also introduced a special wage subsidy to replace the emergency period one that ran out, and they're putting some more than $300 million into the first stage of that, and that's coming on stream now to save, they think, 40,000 jobs. So yeah, things being tided over, and long term, we'll have to see where we are next year.
What's been going on with housing, Colin? Because obviously, if the bounce back is working, what's the impact in that crucial part of people's lives?
Yeah, well, it's very important in New Zealand. Historically, home ownership, very important to people, and it's been an easy way to make money if you already own a home. So, unfortunately, interest rates being so low and, quantitative easing in the economy, it's been easy to borrow money. And in fact, because the housing market had been running hot for years with speculators and investors, the government had introduced a special loan-to-value scheme. So you had to put up a very high proportion of the house's value in order to then borrow the money. Now, that was taken off because COVID made things harder for people to buy their first homes. But of course, that meant that the people who already owned the property swamped the market, and house prices are running out of control. And our Prime Minister had staked her job, her reputation, saying, I will never tax or bring in capital gains tax. So you can still make money and profits from this hot housing market pretty much tax-free in New Zealand. So I think that's got to change, and they'll have to look at ways of doing it, because we're developing a real two-speed society now. People who have property and people who don't.
Would that dent her image if she had to give way on that?
It really would, because, as they often say, the voting classes are the people with assets and property and so on. It's a generation rent, as they're now calling it, that tends not to vote or be quite so politically active. But the Prime Minister said it very clearly that no government she leads will ever do this. But of course, there might be other ways, other adjustments to the tax system. But so far, in the run-up to she's just been elected about 6 weeks ago, and a very, very tiny increase in tax policy, just a tiny increment for the highest earners. But I think as inequality really increases and we see the people really losing out from the post-COVID economy and those who are gaining quite substantially, there's going to have to be some adjustment there, I think.
Yeah, really interesting. Right, got a lot more to talk about, Colin. Glad you can stay with us through the second half of the show here on Business Matters. Friday going into Saturday, winding up the week with Fergus Nicol and Colin Peacock. And we're going to talk a lot about President Trump in the second half of the programme. What happens after the White House years are over? Will legal problems and some debts about to be called in pose him some problems?
This is the BBC World Service, looking at climate change.
A climate study endorsed by 11,000 scientists warns there'll be untold human suffering unless...
The message is stark.
These aren't anyone's opinions or political views.